Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing The English and Their History by Robert Toombs. So this, as you might be able to tell, is quite a large book, coming in at just under 1,000 pages. And as you can guess from the title, The English and Their History, it is also quite ambitious in the scope of the book. So I have decided to break this review up into smaller sections. I think it's just going to be more manageable. And as you can tell from my sticky noting, in just the first section of the book, I have found a number of interesting things that I want to discuss with you. And I fear if I read all 1,000 pages at once, I'm going to be left with too much to discuss and not enough memory on my phone to film a book review. So I'm going to be breaking this into sections. The timeline of this book moves very, very quickly, but I'm going to be reviewing part 1 and the prelude today. This is about 85 pages, and I have quite a bit of interesting things to talk about. I'm going to discuss some interesting highlights from each chapter, as well as read some sections that I personally found interesting from each section. And at the end, I'm going to suggest some books that I also have reviews on, if anything in this book review sounded interesting and you would like to go further. And as always, if you've read this book or have any thoughts or comments, please leave that in the comment section down below. I love interacting with my viewers and hearing your thoughts and comments as well. You're able to provide a different perspective that me reading a book on my own am just not able to provide. So let's jump into the first part of The English and Their History. This first section that I am going to be reviewing is the part that is called The Dreamtime, and part 1, which is Birth of a Nation, which makes up chapters 1 and 2. And because the book is quite large, I'm going to be using this stuffed seal to prop the book on, so you're going to see me looking down as I read some of these sections. The Dreamtime kind of brings us up to post-Roman Britain, is about where the Dreamtime covers. So we do take a little bit of time at the beginning of the book to give a very, very high-level overview of the prehistory of Britain, as well as going into the knowledge that was present in the ancient world. So there was knowledge in the Greek world that there was this island, but there wasn't too much known about it. That is where it acquired the name Britannica, or Britannia from, was the Greek explorer Pytheas. So there is some knowledge in the ancient world which is touched on. In the Dreamtime section, the author also discusses the Roman occupation of Britain, which is already its own subset of history, falling as part of the Roman Roman history, but there is a brief overview of Julius Caesar and invasions and how the Romans interacted with the natives who were living there. There is then a time which we would call sub-Roman Britain, I believe is the term, which is this time period after the Romans pulled out. So the Romans pulled out, they were shrinking the amount of area they were going to be responsible for due to a number of internal pressures, and the Romans pulled out of Britain. This left it open for opportunity, and what wound up happening is the invasion of these Germanic tribes, sometimes called the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, or the Anglo-Saxons. It was a Germanic invasion, but there was a level of mixing or intermarriage with the local population as well. But this did change the character of the area where the Anglo-Saxons settled. It's also a large contribution of the Germanic portion of our language. In another book I read, they discussed how little of the original inhabitants of the island, how little of their language is even retained in the English that we speak today. But this is where we have a large Germanic influence on the island. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about, which is probably most interesting, is on page 18, which is discussing this sub-Roman Britain period. This is about the life expectancy, which just puts into perspective how far we've come as a people group, which is on page 18. A grim insight into the realities of a life that was nasty, brutish, and short is given by studies of Buckland Cemetery near Dover, in use from about the 480s to the 750s. At least 20% of the population died before the age of 18. Women's remains are far more numerous than those of men, as men died away from home in war or hunting. Yet of those remaining, women had a lower life expectancy due to the dangers of childbirth. The average age of those who died at home was 31, for men 38. only 6% lived beyond 60. The lucky survivors commonly had dental problems, disabling damage to the joints, badly healed fractures, and endemic diseases such as tuberculosis. Among the warrior nobility, the women stood a little more chance of surviving childbirth than among the common people, but the men were more likely to die violently. So something that just was an asterisk in my mind to return to is why women might have a better chance of surviving childbirth when belonging to a wealthier class in this time. So something in this book is because of how much history is being covered, the author moves through topics very, very quickly, but I found the topics to be very, very fascinating. However, in an example like this, I feel like I want to dig deeper, but I'm not able to. So one of my questions just here that I wanted to leave a sticky note to return to is why women who are wealthier were more likely to survive childbirth. Is it because they could afford to have retainers around? I would think that some of the dangers faced with childbirth without modern medicine might be bleeding out, might be like a breech birth. I'm trying to think of other things that go wrong. Bleeding, basically bleeding out, the child strangling itself on the umbilical cord. I think that can happen. I personally have not given birth ever, so I'm not super aware of all the dangers, but those are some things that I know can happen. And I don't really know how stopping bleeding, which in my mind is like the number one thing is someone starts to bleed out in childbirth, how that could be prevented or is more likely to be prevented. The only thing I could think of is if you were wealthier, maybe you had access to more food, so maybe you were able to survive things in childbirth better because maybe you had more robust fat supplies. I'm not a medical person, but I did have questions about that, and that was just something interesting. And as you can tell, I have many interesting things that we are going to be getting to. But the dream time is over, and that brings us up to part 1, which is called The Birth of the Nation. Birth of the Nation is divided into 2 chapters, one called This Earth, This Realm, and chapter 2 called The Conqueror's Kingdom. So in this first section, the author is using 1066 as an inflection point to break the birth of the nation into 2 parts, which makes sense. 1066, one of the most important dates in English history, the Battle of Hastings, the Norman invasion, which led to many, 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 many fundamental changes in the way that English society was structured and run. So 1066 makes good sense as a point. So chapter 1, I wanted to touch on 4 things. The first is how English history, or what we can think of as English history, because the formation of an English identity is not yet there yet, compares to Europe at this time. Second is Christianity. 3 is the Viking issues. And 4th, the problem of succession, which is something that I've seen in other books that I've read. So the first is, when we discuss the birth of a nation, is the fact that England differed greatly from the continental Europe. So at the very beginning of this part 1, it says England had a troubled birth at a troubled time. During the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, transforming events of human history were taking place far away. The great Chinese Empire was reunited under the Tang Dynasty. The Emperor Justinian struggled to reestablish the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople. The new monotheistic religion of Islam began its conquest of Western Asia, the southern Mediterranean, and Iberia. Britain, along with most of the former Western Roman Empire, had been transformed by an influx of marauding war bands. But unlike most provinces, it did not come under the power of a single Germanic conqueror with a large army. So England didn't come under this centralized control as quickly as these other things, or these other provinces in Western Europe did. And that makes it different. And also, it's kind of touched on here, there's some other big events happening elsewhere in the world, and England's kind of just doing its own thing. Later in this same paragraph, the author says, moreover, it lacked a Romanized native elite strong enough to Christianize and organize the invaders. Hence, it became the most fragmented and paganized part of the former Roman Empire. And we see this because Christianity had to be reintroduced, or I think it was reintroduced, to the Isle in 597 through St. Augustine. And there is this idea that, there's this idea that the Pope Gregory, who sent St. Augustine, was one of the first people who maybe made a comment implying the Angles as a unified group upon seeing a slave. Of course, I'm sure that is not well noted, or that's not the only time, but we're starting to see a slower, maybe cohesive identity form as opposed to other places in the former Roman Empire. And that is just my opinion. I should put a little note here. Any mistakes in this book review are due to my misinterpretation of the book and not Robert Toombs. Do not assume Robert Toombs has incorrect information. First, assume that I misunderstood the information. So Christianity does have to be reintroduced, and along with the reintroduction of Christianity brings about the introduction of literacy. And there's a lot of discussion in this first chapter about the importance of literacy and the importance of having a vernacular written culture, which which is very different from a lot of the rest of Western Europe. So we see some differences immediately forming between the rest of Western Europe, places that will in the future become places like Germany. Germany doesn't form for a while, of course, France, Spain. These are modern terms for what we would call, but these regions are almost on a little bit of a different trajectory, we can see. Although each of them, of course, have their own unique story as well. So I don't want to lump them all together, but England's kind of already doing their own thing, which is occurring. So on page 29, there's another source of cohesion, and that is around a threat. If English identity began as a religious concept, it took political form in response to a deadly external threat, which overturned the political structure of the island and the near continent, the Vikings. So the Vikings become an issue that need to be dealt with, and these are dealt with by Alfred. He's a key king who is responsible for mitigating or reducing the threat of the Vikings, which is important and also gives a cohesive common enemy, which we're going to see again after the conquest. Having a cohesive or uniting together against a common enemy can be quite powerful. So we see that here, and we see that again post-conquest. Another thing that's happening around this time of the Vikings and with Alfred and the importance of Alfred as a key figure is again the rise of the English vernacular. Here is a quote on page 33. English became the language of government. And I think that's really important that Latin didn't become the language of government. It was English, permitting more direct contact with the population. So there's not at this point any sort of linguistic difference between the population and government. It was also the language of courtly culture. Nowhere else in Europe except Ireland would have a vernacular high culture for another 3 centuries. Written English text, often precious works of art, would become the property of whole communities, held in great churches, read out publicly on holy days, and also used to record important events, names of guildsmen and freed slaves, legal decisions, which are written into the margin or added pages. So we already have a vernacular English culture which is developing, which again, it differs from a lot of other places except Ireland, as already mentioned. So I think that's really important and occurring with Alfred around the same time he's dealing with this Viking issue. But the most important, or one of the biggest challenges that had to be faced, is succession. So succession is something, having read a couple biographies of some of these early Anglo-Saxon kings, is something that was not really well addressed. And the issue of not being able to easily name a successor when a king died wound up leading to a lot of issues, the biggest of which being after Edward the Confessor's death, there not being a clear successor, and therefore leading to the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion. So I'm just going to read a section that starts on page 37. But the kingdom had a fundamental flaw, the inability to provide secure and orderly succession. In part, this was accident. Unlike the French Capetians, installed in 987, who managed to produce viable male heirs for centuries after the death of Edgar in 975 at age 32, the house of, I think it's Cerdic, was blighted by too many heirs or by too few, by child heirs, and by several untimely deaths, not all from natural causes, as we shall see. The system for passing on the crown was a dangerous mixture of inheritance, bequest, and election. Ideally, this would confer a triple strength. An adult and competent member of the royal family would be chosen by the existing king as the heir and recognized by the Witan. But circumstances were not ideal, and then there could be several rival claimants, sometimes brothers, uncles, children, fighting for the crown and often for their lives, or at least their eyes, as blinding was one way of disqualifying contenders. The most catastrophic succession conflict in 1066 led to the subjugation of England. So succession was a weak point that they did not have ironed out at this point. So succession needed to be figured out, and it wasn't, and ultimately would wind up being the downfall. At the end of This Earth, This Realm, which again covers from about 600 AD or about St. Augustine's visit in 597 to 1066, is the various conquests. So the succession led to various conquests, led to a lot of problems. These conquests included Danish conquest and ultimately the Norman conquest, which is where we're going to jump to chapter 2, the Conqueror's Kingdom, post Battle of Hastings and post William the Conqueror's conquest. So post-conquest. First of all, beginning chapter 2, I feel like the first line is very important. Though the conquest preserved many institutions, it yet changed the way England was ruled. Before, government depended largely on consent. Now it was dominated by force. Unlike his predecessors, the conqueror claimed to be lord of all the lands. This was the political revolution of the conquest. So there was a maybe bit of a consolidation of power, and the conquest is going to have massive, massive implications. But there is a lot that changes around here, which is going to influence the rest of English history. The first is, I believe it's pronounced Domesday Book. And this was a survey of the land to kind of give William an idea of what he had just conquered. And this is a very, very interesting, unique look into it's almost a snapshot of England at this time. And I think it's very interesting because I'm not sure how many documents like this exist elsewhere in world history. I'm sure there are some, but this seems to be very, very unique. Something that I found interesting on page 50, it shows England as a rich and developed agricultural country with its forest already reduced to 20th century levels, nearly all today's villages already in embryo, and as much land under the plow as in 1900. So seeing in one way how far we've come, if we think of a previous sticky note I referenced with women dying very young from childbirth, to how much hasn't changed with all of your villages. So if you live, I guess, in England today, I wonder how easy, it probably is quite easy to find your village referenced in this book. So I felt that was interesting, and this is a unique source for history that I've seen referenced again and again. There is the introduction of hierarchy in a way that hasn't existed before, and this hierarchy splits, so then the people who were Anglo-Saxons, we're now thinking of them as like the English population, were kind of subservient to the French Norman invaders. However, there were so many of these English that they did become mixed into the hierarchy, and in doing so were able to maintain English religious and cultural traditions. So they might not be the top of the church hierarchy, but they still existed in the church hierarchy, and they could still be very significant members of society. I'm guessing the Normans just had to kind of work with them, and for that reason, English language, while being significantly changed, was still retained in some aspect. That's why we, to this day, still have a German base to our language, in a sense. You'll notice if you English is heavily influenced by both German and French, and if the Normans, I guess, had completely wiped out any reference, you would think we would be much more French-based. That's me extrapolating from this, but there was a hierarchy imposed after the conquest, but it wasn't completely wiping out the people who were there, and so the English tradition was maintained. As we have seen, this is on page 55, as we have seen, Old English and Irish were the most developed of Europe's vernaculars. English had a standardized written form by the late 10th century, whereas French had no written literature at all until, ironically, it was pioneered in post-conquest England, as we shall see, perhaps an imitation of Anglo-Saxon literature. So not only are the Normans are, of course, having a massive impact on England, but also the English tradition is having an impact on French and French vernacular. So the English vernacular tradition does survive. There is, though, however, maybe most importantly, a change in personal names. This is on page 56. When you read these biographies of pre-conquest England, there are many names which are just not used anymore. So here's some here that I'm going to, again, butcher. Ealdgith, Elfgifu, Calswain, Edric, Welttheof, which are names that to me feel very foreign, very old. Well, post-conquest, we have William, John, Richard, Robert, Margaret, Mary, Emma. So these are names that are much more familiar to us. So there is a change towards maybe more Norman, more French personal names post-conquest. Now, there is a post-conquest identity that does form, and key, as already mentioned, is maybe uniting versus a common enemy. So on page 64, well, the Normans and the English kind of are still in the process. There is some animosity. They do start to form a more cohesive singular identity, and something that could be seen as helping that is a battle. The Scots, as usual, this is on page 64, took advantage of the political chaos in England to invade. They were defeated in 1138 in Yorkshire at the Battle of the Standard by a Norman and English army led by the Archbishop of York, carrying local religious symbols as their standard. This battle has been described as a catalyst of post-conquest English identity in the face of a common enemy. So there is some instances where they start to work together. Now, as there is this ongoing conflict between how much of an influence Normandy is going to have on England, and England trying to forge its way as its own unique culture or its own cohesive identity post-conquest. We have a couple kings which are useful to mention. The first being Henry II. Something that Henry II is known for is his legal precedences. This is on page 68, his drive for law and order saw the introduction in 1160s of traveling judges. So there was a way to access royal justice. There's this idea of common law, and this was fundamentally different from how justice was practiced on the continent. Henry extended the King's Peace to cover all times, the whole realm, all men. This contrasted with much of Europe, where what was commonly called the feudal revolution fragmented jurisdiction. A long-term divergence also began between English and continental legal principles. In Europe, law would either remain local, a patchwork of different customs, or become transnational by borrowing Roman law enshrined in the Code of Justinian. The English common law was the first national system of law in Europe. And also they go on to say it uses French terms like debt, contract, heir, trespass, court, judge, and jury, and until 1731 it kept records in Latin. So these legal changes still have precedent, or maybe not precedence the right word, but it still has influence today in the idea of things like juries, and also was part of a differing between England and its history with the continent. Henry II is also remembered for the murder of Thomas Becket, who was a Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered December 29th, 1170, in Canterbury Cathedral. The story goes, so this was catapulted by Henry II wanting to have more close political control of the church. Thomas Becket, who I believe was actually put in his position by Henry II, pushed back a little bit. Henry II, the story goes, whether this is apocryphal or not can be up for debate. I think it's generally probably occurred a little differently, but he said, "Will someone rid me of this troublesome priest," or something, and some knights took that literally and rode out and killed him. And despite, my understanding is that he was not well liked while he was alive, despite that he was canonized quite quickly after death, and actually due to all of this, the clergy and the church won some immunities that lasted all the way post-Reformation. So there were some real consequences, and Thomas Becket is a name that comes up. So that is how Henry II is brought into things. Then we have Richard I, the Lionheart, and Prince John, who becomes King John. Richard I is known for his crusading activities. He's known for never being home. He was home, I think, for home being in England. I think he was only there for 6 months, if I remember correctly, of his reign. He was at one point locked up in Europe. He was traveling back from the Crusades and got locked up somewhere in, I believe it was Central Europe. And the story goes his faithful servant, minstrel, someone had to go sing, faithful minstrel had to go sing outside his prison, and then they being the English, had to increase their taxes to get the ransom to get their king back, which was very disappointing for everybody. But he's also tied in closely with the Robin Hood myth around this time. So we have here on page 71, the longest living part of the Richard myth comes from his later association with the Robin Hood stories, in which his bravery, goodness, and common touch personify an ideal English king, in contrast with the Norman vices of the cruel and duplicitous Prince John and his unscrupulous sheriff, which comes into play because Prince John has a little bit of a bad reputation, primarily, in my mind, from these Robin Hood myths. He becomes king in 1199 and has a uniquely bad reputation, according to this book. So something he's known for is being forced to sign the Magna Carta, which is going to lead to the rudimentary openings of Parliament. Something else that comes out is the right to have trial by jury. So the decision of guilt and innocence is handed over to a jury, something which we still see today. I have had to go through a jury process. I was not guilty or innocent. I had to go sit and decide if I was going to be polled to sit on one of those, but that is something that has a very long history. So it's something that we still do today. And this was because there was a decline in the trial by ordeal, which is where you might walk on, dunking in water or holding hot coals. So that was because the Fourth Lateran Council banned priests from taking part in ordeals. And so after that occurred, the king and the judges didn't know what to do besides keep people locked up indefinitely, and that's where this jury thing came from. Now, the jury wasn't exactly perfect. There were sometimes penalties if the jury delivered the wrong verdict, but overall, this is something that has continued into our modern justice system, at least here in the United States. And Europe goes by a different route. Europe is going to continue doing their own thing, which we see this deviation in legal principles between England and the continent. And finally, most importantly, is the beginnings of Parliament, something that is very, very instrumental and I think is going to come up again and again in the rest of this book. That is where I'm going to leave things for now. The first part of this book has been absolutely fascinating. Please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below. I'm going to leave recommendations for future books in the comments if you would like to read books that go into all of this stuff that I just covered in more detail. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.